Hello and welcome back to Weekends with WiseJ. This week we're going to do some refactoring. Currently our game grid uses strings and instead we're going to refactor it so that it uses game objects. So first let's go to our game grid. And you can see right here, right, it's an array of strings. So we want it to be an array of game objects. And we need to create the game object class. There we go. Let me paste in some code. So it's very simple. It just has an x coordinate and a y coordinate. And then all of the objects in the game will derive from this. So like player, wall, and then eventually bullet. So let's go ahead and create a player and a wall class, again, that just derive from GameObject. There's player. And there's wall. And then you can see, right, that is derived from GameObject, and player also is derived from GameObject. Okay, so let's go back to our GameGrid class. Does not recognize GameObject. Oh. Because we need to say using game. There we go. Okay. Okay. Right, and then we just have to fix everywhere that this is referred to as a string. So we've got that fixed. Grid equals new string. This should be game object. This will be the set of string that represents the object to be written to the grid. This will be the game object to be written to the grid. And this won't be a string, this will be a game object. We'll just go ahead and call that G instead of S. Let's see, I'm going to be a little bit lazy here, so this will be a game object. I'm not going to bother to change that because that won't affect how the code actually runs. If you do look on GitHub, all the code will be correct and it'll be G instead of S, and all the strings will be correct, but just to be a little bit quicker here. Let's see, so this needs to be game object. Again, I'm just going to leave that as S, but it's correct on the GitHub. And let's see. So this here, right, we're testing if the object, or well, if the string in that location was equal to player, and if the string in the new location was equal to wall. And instead we're going to test the type, right, because these are no longer strings. So if I change that, right, so, oh, I pasted that wrong. Grid previous, X previous. Let me paste that. Okay, so here, so the grid, the object at the coordinates grid previous, X previous, Y previous, dot get type, if that type is player, and the grid object at the coordinates x new, y new, dot get type is wall, right? As opposed to before where we were testing if the things at those coordinates were equal to certain strings, right? So now instead of if it's equal to string player, it's equal to type of player. And same with Last here we have read from grid, right? And it is not going to return a string. It's going to return a game object. And now if it's empty, because it returns a game object, we have to return something. So we're just going to return a new game object. And let's go ahead and make sure that compiles. It does not. What am I missing? Ah, right. So this code here, right? So we're writing to the grid. We were writing strings. Now we need to write game objects. All right, so let's fix these compiler errors. So the walls are pretty easy. That just needs to be a new wall, right? So it's a wall object instead of a string. Same thing for the rest of my walls. The player, however, is a little bit trickier. So we could just create a new player object. But then when you get to, here where we're moving, we don't want to just create a new player object every time we move the player. We want it to be the same player object that we're moving around within the grid. So what I need to do is create a player object at the beginning and then move it around. I'm also going to go ahead and modify my player class. So here's player.cs, and let's add a little bit to it. So here we've just added an ID, and then it has, if you look at the player constructor, right, we set up our ID, and then we also have X and Y. So this will work later on for multiplayer, right? Each player will have their own unique ID. And then X and Y, if you remember GameObject, right? GameObject has the X and Y coordinate. So that's all that is the X and Y coordinate are getting created when we create the player, and then they're getting sent on to GameObject. So if we look at here, our player, let's go ahead and create them. I'll just create them up here. And let's see, so that's just an empty player object. And then in the constructor of page 1, we'll go ahead and actually create that, right? How about right after the grid? So here our player has an ID of 1, that's the first one, an X coordinate of 1, and a Y coordinate of 1. Okay, let's see. So here, we're just going to use our player, right? So that's our object that we just created. We're just reusing it here. And every other time that we were using the player string, we can just use our player object. Right, so this is, again, just like in GameObject here. Nope, not in GameObject, in GameGrid. When we were comparing, right, we had to use getType instead of seeing if it was equal to a string. So I can just use getType there. So val.getType equals type of player. And then if val.getType equals type of, this will be wall. Okay, and that should compile now. Build succeeded. Awesome. Okay, so we're using player objects, we're using wall objects now. Our game grid is based on objects instead of strings. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to modify this WriteToGrid function. Currently it takes a game object, an X, and a Y. But if you remember, our game object actually has an X and a Y property, in this case X coordinate and Y coordinate. So we don't actually need to send in an X and a Y. The game object should be enough. So let's go ahead and modify that. No X and Y parameters. Let's see. So we're going to do g.x and g.y, and then g.x, g.y. And if we look in GameObject, I didn't actually call them x and y, I called them x coordinate and y coordinate, but let's just call them x and y. And let's go ahead and add a little constructor here. Right, so whenever we create a game object, we'll send it x coord and y coord, and those will get set equal to x and y. Okay, so that's good. We just need to make sure that the classes that derive from GameObject, so player and wall, have this code as well. So, right, so if I look at player, I was calling them x and y here, so I'm actually going to call them x coord and y coord. There we go, that should be good. Oh, and then this derives from the base. So to the base constructor we will send x coord and y coord. There we go. We need to modify wall as well, which is pretty simple. There we go. Again, we're just taking x and y and we're just sending it into the base constructor. Let's see. That should be everything. Let's see if this builds. Ah, right. So now whenever I create a game object, I need to send it an x and a y. So let's see. That needs x and y. This wall needs the x and the y. Right, so they're just going inside of the wall constructor instead of being outside. Oh, no, missing a parenthesis. Oh, again with the player. Right, so when we write the player to the grid, so I can just send it the player. Right, if you remember, the player was created earlier, right? So that's where I'm sending the values in the constructor, and then we send the player object in. Okay, so now, let's try and build this. Build completed, cool. And let's just double check that it runs real quick. There we go. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is in GameGrid.cs, this MovementAttemptWriteToGrid, just like before with the previous function, you'll notice we're sending it our game object and also the x and y coordinate of the game object, right? The x previous and y previous. X new and y new we still need, because those are the new coordinates it's going to move to. But x previous and y previous, we don't need those anymore. The other thing that we don't need is it returns an array of integers, right? The point that it moved to. And we don't need that because we can just set the coordinates, the x and y coordinates of the game object. So let's go ahead and fix this. So let's change that to void. And let's get rid of these two. Again, it's GameObject G in the final version, but we're just being lazy and leaving it as S. And so this is, I kept it as S, so we'll just do that as S. Right, so we're just getting the coordinates from the game object and setting them at x previous and y previous. Right, we're not returning this point anymore, so we don't need this code. And instead, we just need to set the x and y coordinates of the game object to be the new positions. Again, that is S, not G. We don't need a lot of this code. So if you look at this code, we're not doing the point, right? So that's not happening, that's not happening. that's not happening, right? So all of this can get commented out, right? So nothing happens in there, which means nothing happens in all of this else statement. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And then let's go ahead and build this. It won't run, but just so you can see the errors. Here we go. Right, so every time we call movement attempt write to grid, well, now we're sending it too many things. And we're also assuming it's going to return this array of integers, this point, which it no longer does. So we're in page1.cs here. So every time we click a button to move the player, right, and we call this movement attempt write to grid, that's where we're getting this errors, right? So we've got 4 errors, 1 for each direction. So let's just fix each of these. So button up should be, let me make that bigger so you can see the whole thing. Should just be that, right? So we got rid of the player.x, player.y, right? The previous positions. And we got rid of that here. I'll modify this next one here maybe a little bit more clearly instead of the copy paste. So get rid of that. Get rid of that. Get rid of player.x, player.y, which was the previous positions of the player. Right, and there we go. And same for the rest. And save that. Let's make sure it builds. And let's do a good test. Let's make sure it runs and make sure that we still can't go through walls. Well, that's awkward. I can't move. What have I done wrong here? Okay, so let's fix this error. So you notice that the one that I pasted in is actually correct. It says player.x and player.y. So these, we need to get rid of player.x and player.y, which wasn't a typo. They were, here we go, right? We used to use player.x and player.y to keep track of the player position, but we don't have those anymore. We just have the x and y coordinates of the player. So player.x, player.y, and player.x, player.y. Okay, now let's go ahead and run that. There we go, I can move different directions. And then let's test the wall. Can't go through walls. Beautiful. All right, so that is the end of this week's episode and the end of our refactoring. We now successfully are using game objects and writing them to the grid instead of strings. See you later.